Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Dr. A.C. Chivase, the Acting Vice Principal, Teaching, Learning, Community Engagement, and Student Support. This evening, I shall be presiding over this phenomenal and momentous occasion of the University of South Africa. The inaugural lecture of Professor Ramudungwane Tabane, the School Director of Educational Studies, College of Education here at UNISA. Allow me to pass warm greetings to Professor Puleng Linkabula, the Principal and Vice Chancellor of UNISA. Prof. Mpini Makwe, the Executive Dean, College of Education. Professor Ramudungwane Tabane, our inaugural person from the School Director of Educational Studies, College of Education. And our honorable respondent, Professor B. Diale, Executive Dean for the College of Education, Sol Plaatje University. Family members, friends, and associates of Professor Tabane in attendance this evening. Colleagues, students, all of you present this evening, I greet you all. A very good and warm evening and welcome to all of you. At the core of inaugural lecture is a memorable journey to celebrate, acknowledge, and welcome our own to the new world of research agenda, professorship. An inaugural lecture is the highest peak in the academic journey, the point of becoming a full professor conferred by the university. Today we gather to honor eminence in scholarship as fantastically demonstrated by Prof. Tabane. Marking the significant milestone of becoming a full professor, the inaugural lecture is a formal address through which a newly appointed academic introduces their research and scholarly passions to their university colleagues. This occasion serves as a celebration of their accomplishments and expertise, an opportunity for intellectual exchange within the academic community, and a platform to articulate their vision for future role and impact on both university and society. Indeed, this event represents a crucial rite of passage in a scholar's journey, embodying the culmination of years of unwavering dedication and diligent work. With Prof. Tabane, we can confidently say you are a professor today, even outside the halls of the University of South Africa. It is thus befitting for our university to join hands and celebrate you and your illustrious journey. Prof. Tabane will address us on the topic early identification of neurodiverse disorders to enhance mental health access. In this lecture, Prof. Tabane promises to explore the critical issue of early identification of neurodiverse disorders to access mental health services in South Africa. He will highlight the alarming statistics revealing that many South Africans suffer from diverse mental health conditions, including neurodiverse disorders such as ADHD and autism spectrum disorder. Prof. Tabane will discuss the urgent need for effective early intervention strategies, emphasizing that timely diagnosis can prevent severe social and academic challenges later in life. He will also explore the role of the National Health Insurance in providing equitable access to mental health care, while advocating for a collaborative approach that combines traditional and modern practices. Through his research and advocacy, he aims to raise awareness and improve mental health outcomes for children and adolescents, ensuring that no one is left behind in accessing mental health services. At this point, I wish to call Prof. Pini Makwe, the Executive Dean, College of Education, to introduce the scholar. After the submission of the inaugural lecture by Professor Tabane, the response shall be provided by Professor B. Dialem, Executive Dean for the College of Education, Sol Plaatje University. Prof. Makwe, please be so kind to proceed in introducing our guest person and of the moment this evening.
Dumelang, Kgotsong, to the family, friends, colleagues, tsa Ntate Professor Ramudungwane Tabane, who have gathered here today just to watch this special moment of Professor Tabane. Professor Tabane is our current Director of Educational Studies, and he is a professor in the Department of Psychology of Education in the College of Education. Professor Tabane was born in Mamelodi, Tshwane, attended both primary and high school there, and matriculated at Mamelodi High School. Washeng, as his grandmother will call him, recognizing that he is named after his great-grandfather. Professor Tabane is the only rose among the thorns, as the only son with two sisters, siblings to his single parent. He pays deep gratitude to his mother and grandmother for the unwavering support throughout his life. With the Sepedi idiom, I'm going to try this. It's in Sepedi. Kodumela mwepa tutsi ahuli humo lele tswago huswi. Loosely translated, it means perseverance comes with wealth, it comes with joy. You don't have to sit still and expect something to happen to you. Thank you, Professor Tabane, for sharing this. He then went to study for teaching degree after not being selected in law at the University of Pretoria. As a student from disadvantaged background, like many students were at the time, he had to find means to pay for studies after being afforded a 7,000 bank loan for first year of undergraduate degree, where he did a BA in school guidance in 1997. At the University of Pretoria, he was appointed teaching assistant at that time, and later as a student worker at the same university. He worked in the library. He also worked in the Department of Educational Psychology. He subsequently occupied a few contract positions at the University of Pretoria as a student assistant, tutor, and contract lecturer. Professor Tabane learned to appreciate and enjoy growth in academia and subsequently applied for honor studies in educational psychology. As this involved a selection process, he unfortunately did not make it and thus registered for a B.Ed school guidance honors in 2000. He reapplied and was selected for the B.Ed educational psychology honors part-time in 2001. He then did the M.Ed educational psychology and graduated in 2005, and subsequently enrolled and completed his PhD in educational psychology in 2010. All these qualifications were completed at the University of South Africa. All these qualifications were completed at the University of Pretoria. There are various reasons for doing all his degrees at one university. Among it was the proximity and the fact that the University of Pretoria was one of the leading universities in the program of educational psychology at the time. Furthermore, he was awarded various opportunities as a student during that time. One was to work as a research assistant, which culminated in some publications. And also he was mentored at that very same space at the Faculty of Education. And he did a lot of things, including editing the Faculty of Education newsletter. As an aspiring academic, he has published various articles, chapters, edited a book, and co-authored a number of articles. However, of note is his first academic article that he co-authored with his supervisor, Professor A.C. Bauer, which was entitled The Influence of Cross-Cultural Interviewing on the Generation of Data in 2006. This research piece arose his research interest and specifically on research methodology as a discipline. Thus, his focus of his PhD on the innovative usage of the research methodology called interactive qualitative analysis. This research methodology is still being taught at some universities that provide specific training on it. This thesis and the article are used as part of training resources for this kind of a methodology. Professor Tabane, over and above being a scholar, he is registered as an independent psychologist in 2004, and he opened his own practice in Sunnyside and Mamelodi. In 2007, he was appointed for 1 year as a student counselor at the University of Johannesburg, Davidson campus. He continued working in his psychology practice and was involved in a training company called Institute of Training Development as a trainer and later as a director for Care Works training. And this happened between 2008 and 2010. In this company, they were involved in the mental health and soft skill training in the mines and similar industries, where the major focus at the time was on training workers as peer educators for HIV and AIDS drive program funded by USAID. In 2011, he was involved as a consultant in a health research company called Broadridge Health as a principal investigator on the study entitled An Exploratory Study of How Traditional Health Practitioners in South Africa Communicate Their Concepts of Disease, Risk, and Prevention to their patient. And this culminated in other research reports and research articles and conference papers, which he presented all over the place. This research is still very relevant today as the country continues to battle with a collegial working relationship between traditional health, mental health, and allopathic medicine. In 2011, during the recession, he joined the University of South Africa as a lecturer and was promoted to senior lecturer in 2013 and to associate professor in 2018 and full professor last year. Since 2011, when he joined UNISA, he was involved in teaching both postgraduate and undergraduate in different capacities. However, his interest is mainly on neurodevelopment disorder called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, which he has worked with, including collaborating with colleagues from University of London and University of Southampton. He visited them in 2014 and was involved in several lectures. In 2016, he co-authored and published a book, My Child Has ADHD, Help, as part of this research project. From 2015 to 2017, he served as the chairperson of the Society of Educational Psychology of South Africa, of Psychological Society of South Africa. He was appointed to serve on the board of the South African Medical Legal Association in 2019. And at the same time, he was appointed as the COD in the Department of Psychology of Education, and in 2022 was appointed School Director of Educational Studies. He is currently a leader of community engagement project called Asset Mapping, Breaking the Cycle of Poverty, with a research-led interest in ADHD, he has since joined forces with a colleague in the Department of Science and Technology Education to work on this project. And the study it talks about the impact of ADHD on the learning and teaching of this subject. Colleagues, friends, family, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Tabane, who today will be inaugurated as a professor, a scholar of note, and this is the pinnacle of his profession in the academic space. Now, Prof. Tabane, rise and share with us your scholarship over the years.
Professor Puleng Lengabula, the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, the University of the Land, University Yamabu. Dr. Chivase, the Acting Vice Principal, Teaching and Learning, Student Support and Community Engagement. Professor Mpine Makwe, Dean of the College of Education, UNISA. My distinguished respondent, Professor Boitumelo Diale, Dean of the Faculty of Education, Sol Plaatje University. Mrs. Nokulunga Tabane, Waka, Mohajaka, my wife, thank you for all the support. Ke a leboga, ke leboga thekgo. You are the one. O tshogofaditše le Phenyo, my sons, for your belief and constant challenge. You make me a better father. Rahab Tabane, my mother, thank you for all that you have done, and thank you to all the Tabane clan. In memory of my grandmother, Mancha Tlogela Phatla Ishalelebeng, Virginia Tabane, my uncle, Charles Paleng Tabane, Rena Baga Tabane, we've made it. My talk, my inaugural lecture, is going to be based on the following topic: early identification of neurodiverse disorders to enhance mental health access. World Health Day, which is celebrated on the 10th of October, is an international day for global mental health education, awareness and advocacy against social stigma. This year's theme is access to services, mental health in catastrophe and emergencies. While it is not celebrated like other health issues like cancer, HIV, AIDS, to name few, this is a serious health issue that millions of South Africa are grappling with. However, I undertake my inaugural during the time when there are movements like Doctors Without Borders, with a specific focus on mental health as well as other health issues. The practice of mental health practitioners has changed. However, the attack on healthcare practitioners in areas like Gaza and other war-torn countries are worrisome, to put it mildly. As healthcare practitioners strive to ensure that people of all races have access to mental health, it is thus important that all health practitioners proclaim their support for humanitarian services and ensure that all have access to mental health care services. Access to mental health is a basic human right, and thus it is afforded as per Chapter 2 of the South African Constitution of 1996, specifically Section 27(1)(a), Section 28(1)(c), and Section 29, that speaks to the right to education, the right to health. According to South African Depression and Anxiety Group, SADC, as many as 1 in 6 South Africans suffer from anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, or other substance use problems. Included to mental health are neurodiverse disorders. Neurodiversity disorders encompass combinations and conditions like autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, specific learning disorder, including dyslexia and dysgraphia, and dyspraxia. Recognizing that diverse neurological and cognitive profiles lead to a unique way of perceiving, interacting with, and responding to the world. These are, in the main, what we refer to as childhood disorders, thus the onset being as early as 4 years old. The early identification of neurodiverse disorders and other mental health conditions is key to healthy living and prospective population of any country. Children's Act 38 of 2025 and the Mental Health Act 17 of 2002 action the espoused intention of the Constitution and thus are mechanisms to provide for the basic human right. However, many children are left outside from accessing the mental health services and left behind from accessing the education system due to neurodiverse disorders. The unavailability of resources in the limited public mental health institution is horrific, to say the least. Eugene Elias, former president of the South African Society for Psychiatry, believes that when crime and motor vehicle accidents are taken into consideration, up to 6 million South Africans could suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Another stark reality is that more than 17 million people in South Africa are dealing and living with anxiety disorders, such as agoraphobia and panic disorders. Thus, the urgency of the agency of the National Health Insurance, the NHI, as a transformative agenda for ensuring access to mental health is key, and this must not be taken for granted. The South African Health Insurance Bill was signed into law by President Cyril Ramaphosa on May 15, 2024, establishing the NHI Act to achieve universal health coverage by creating a single publicly funded pool for healthcare services and medicine. The NHI is a social justice agenda. Today, 65% of South Africans cannot afford healthcare, let alone mental health care. One of the challenges is manpower. There are not enough psychologists in South Africa. This profession is unfortunately seen as elitist profession. In South Africa, there are less than 15,000, to be precise, 14,427 stats of 2024 registered mental health practitioners with the Health Profession Council of South Africa. Of these, in 2024, 9,582 are psychologists. The NHI Act aims to provide access to quality health care for all South Africans, regardless of their socioeconomic status, by covering costs at the point of care and phasing in its implementation of several years. It is thus to be noted that mental health care and access to professionals like psychologists are but few the necessary access to services that need to be covered. However, the NHI implementation is correctly so facing ongoing legal challenges as part of checks and balances to ensure that it will meet the muster to cater for the South African population in a country marred with poor service delivery, corruption of all sorts, and maladministration. Therefore, it is important that all checks and balances are made so that this well-intentioned act to create access to services is not another government failure. In attempts to work towards enabling access to services, I was involved as a researcher and investigator in studies that intended to address this limitation. I have further supervised students whose studies are specifically focused on neurodiversity. These are done as a contribution to a big picture to ensuring that neurodiversity and children are not denied the basic health care, mental health care. This is important because the professional that we sought and professionals that we seek to produce in terms of educational psychologists should understand that mental health care for the disadvantaged should be nimble and supportive to keep the population safe. Early identification and intervention for mental health disorder is paramount to a healthy society. Most childhood mental health disorders persist into adulthood and thus graduate to social problems that becomes national catastrophes and pandemics because of poor or no medical or early interventions. Mental health is a serious matter, and mental health matters. Care for child and adolescent mental health issues, that is depression, anxiety, personality disorders, etc., is very important for our country that has a population mostly made up of young people. Not addressing it will be doing an injustice to the country. Learning disorders and other neurodiverse and neurological disorders like autism, spectrum disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder are some of the challenges that South Africans are grappling with and affecting their learning, socialization, and functioning optimally. In South Africa, the prevalence of children with ADHD is about 5.8, which translates to a ratio of 3 to 5. Studies in South Africa focusing on attention deficit hyperactivity disorders are limited. The prevalence of ADHD in South Africa is not well established, and in most cases, we rely on the established Western prevalence numbers. And this should not prevail. Fisher, Hattil, Land, Funk, and Patel, in Perrault, Low, and Kleinhans, state that the prevalence of ADHD in South Africa corresponds, as indicated, with that of the United States and Europe. Thus, a need to build on and establish the prevalence of ADHD in South Africa will be of benefit to the development of the program of early detection and intervention for ADHD. The challenge with ADHD is that it comorbid's with other neurological, behavioral, emotional, psychological disorders, such as conduct disorder, autism, generalized anxiety disorder, and oppositional defiant disorder. May 16, 2023, the report of PIRLS, International Reading Literacy Study, was released. It found that South African grade 4's performance in PIRLS study obtained last position of the 57 countries that participated. It found that 81% of South African grade 4's cannot read for meaning. Children with neurodivergent disorders, and in particular ADHD, that comorbids with learning disorder or positional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, are in most cases found to be the ones that have a high dropout. In severe cases, in conflict with the law. According to Mirza, Roberts, and Mohammed, school dropout is common among children with ADHD. This is true with children with low income family that are more likely to drop out of school or fall in social traps like drugs, abuse, teenage pregnancy, and all sorts of crimes, as well as untreated ADHD. Evidence has established the association between the risk factors of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, severity, according to Danglion, Feller, and Brown. Furthermore, research has shown that some children in juvenile prisons were found to be meeting ADHD criteria. Thus, in such families and communities, the cycle of poverty prevails, as they are characterized by childhood criminals, poor social interaction, and find themselves in conflict with the law, poor parent-child relationships, and in most cases, even sibling relationships. In schools, these learners are said to be problem learners who oppose authority, involve in school vandalism, bullying, and many other unruly disruptive behaviors. According to the study by Kent and others, adolescents with ADHD are significantly more likely to be absent or tardy during academic year, and they were over 8 times more likely than adults without ADHD to drop out of high school. These findings demonstrate that children with ADHD continue to experience severe academic impairment in high school. In the worst case scenario, there are attempts and suicides that surrounds these children. According to Chen, Ho, Huasio, Lu, and Yen, adolescents with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder have a high risk of suicidality and more problems related to school bullying, and quality of life is reportedly associated with suicide or any other social problems and ADHD. In celebrating the National ADHD Day, the Psychology Society of South Africa, SAISA, noted that while ADHD itself is not a direct cause of conflict with the law, it significantly increases the risk of developing behaviors and making decisions that can lead to legal issues. Access to timely diagnosis, proper treatment, and appropriate support system in South Africa are vital to help individuals with ADHD to manage their symptoms and avoid entanglement with the legal system. According to Protection Web, Minister of Correctional Services, responding to the question in Parliament, confirmed that there are 15 juvenile correctional centers in South Africa. These facilities cater to youth offenders aged between 18 and 25, have a combined approved bed space of 4,262. However, as of March 31st, 2025, they were accommodating 5,081 inmates, exceeding the national capacity by over 19%. Thus, the number of youths incarcerated in South African juvenile correctional services brings to the fore the importance of early intervention to access mental health services, and whether these, or at least some, could have been prevented through proper early diagnosis and intervention. These are the future leaders and economically active South Africans who need access to services through different early intervention programs. Thus, it has been important that as academics and practitioners in mental health, that we shape what we do today so that the generation of the future can benefit from it. Thus, as part of my involvement in the 2012 study commissioned by the National Department of Health that I conducted with Health Advance Institute, a concern by the National Department of Health was that healthcare providers like nurses that visit the schools provide basic health physical screening and thus able to pick and attend to physical anomalies of the school children. However, healthcare providers were not able to pick and attend to mental health symptoms. Thus, the study was the development of the mental health screening tools for the Department of Health. In this study, a strengths and difficulties questionnaire was identified and culminated in a report. Health Advance Institute named the usability of strengths and difficulties questionnaire as a universal mental health screening tool to identify learners who are at risk or are suffering from mental health problems in a selected South African public schools. South Africa is an unequal society, and thus there is a section of the population where children with ADHD are not receiving necessary intervention. To respond to this inadequacy, the Department of Basic Education has introduced the screening, assessment, identification, and support, the SAIS, for teachers to be able to screen learners with various behavioral challenges. However, learners with neurodevelopmental disorders are missed, as the subjective reporting by the parents and teachers is not conclusive. In 2017, I embarked on a study called The Gap Between the Objective and Subjective Perception of Child Attention Difficulties. This was a study to be undertaken with and in collaboration with a private company that designs computer software game applications for psychologists to use the screening of ADHD without their practitioner's subjective interference. The study was also part of the South African program for early detection and intervention for ADHD that I was leading. The purpose of this research was to investigate programs and strategies for dealing with ADHD in South Africa. It sought to explore strategies employed by parents with children with ADHD, and furthermore, how teachers can work with learners with ADHD in their classroom. The aim was to develop a program that can be used to detect and devise appropriate intervention strategies for ADHD. The study was undertaken with a colleague from the University of Southampton, UK. The study is on hold, but it will be revised. The third study that I was involved in was the National Department of Health to ensure access to services was in 2023. The study was about mental health services provided to children and adolescents in mental health institutions in South Africa. This study also culminated in a report, a situational analysis of the public mental health services and systems' ability to cater for children's needs and adolescents with psychosocial disabilities in South Africa. It is indeed this study that is of most relevant for the early intervention. In the study, it was found that the number of children and adolescents in mental health facilities are far less than those catered for adults. In some instances, the youth were accommodated in adult wards, which is not ideal solution. This is the same as per correctional services because Section 7(2) of the Correctional Services Act 1998 stipulates that child offenders must be housed separately from adults and in accommodation appropriate for their age. Thus, there is a highlight that capacity is seen to be afforded in later life than rather as a preventative measure by ensuring that childhood mental health disorders are screened, assessed, diagnosed, and intervention is given priority. Thus, the high number of bed capacity in both juvenile correctional centers and mental health services catering for children and adolescents should be sufficient, and thus, by extension, seeing the possible reduction in numbers of incarcerated youth. On a different anecdote, I was also involved as a principal investigator on a study during the prime of HIV and AIDS pandemic in 2012. The study was about ensuring access to health services by South Africans, mostly in rural areas, by training the traditional health practitioners, the THPs, as noted in the THP Act 22 of 2007. The THP Act espoused to establish interim THP Council for South Africa to regulate the practice, training, and conduct of traditional health practitioners. The aim was to ensure that the safety, efficacy, quality of traditional health services protect the public interest and provide a formal framework for registration and professional standards for traditional health practitioners. The Act provisions have been made and brought into full operation through later regulations such as the 2024 THP regulations, creating a formal and recognized system for THPs in South Africa. In the main, my interest as a researcher in this was in the espoused aim of access and to protect the public and give access to health services. This research is still relevant today as the country continues to battle with the collegial working relationship between THPs, mental health, and allopathic medicine. The study was also USAID funded and culminated in a published research report. There have been studies that supported the early intervention that I supervised. In 21, a PhD study by Dr. Foster focused on full services, school teachers' attitude and management strategies of learners with ADHD in the Eastern Cape, while Dr. Maema, may his soul rest in peace, focused on exploring grade 3 teachers' experiences and understanding of ADHD in the Soweto mainstream schools. In 2023, a master's student, Mrs. Makondo, focused on the experiences of distant parented adolescent girls in the Chiridzi South constituency of Zimbabwe. At current, Ms. Rust, in her master's, focuses on the effect of multisensory room on the development of emotional regulations for learners on level 1 of the spectra in a primary mainstream school. Mrs. Daves focuses on the experiences of mainstream primary school educators with implementing inclusive education practices in the Western Cape. Ms. Carpenter focuses on the effect of POI spinning training on ADHD executive functioning skills. And Ms. Leboskachny focuses on the relation between cesarean delivery and the prevalence of neurodevelopmental disorders at birth. While Mr. Chusi, a PhD study, focuses on grade 7 teachers' experiences of adolescents perceived to have ADHD in Eswatini, Lubombo Mainstream School. As part of the HPCSA and serving on the professional board of psychology as a vice chair, we are concerned with the number of psychologists produced and thus the challenge with affording access to services. Now, as a board member, we are involved in consulting the stakeholders on differential pathways of qualifying psychologists. This measure comes after benchmarking was, and still is, continuing to be made with fellow African countries through Association of Medical Councils of Africa, AMCOA, and the international communities through the International Association of Medical Regulators Authorities, IAMRA. These are the platforms that assist us to focus on collaboration and learning from best practices of other countries that are implementing accessible mental health care and universal health care with their challenges, lessons, and good practices and good stories. Thus, it is further important that we teach psychology. We should sensitize our students to efforts like Doctors Without Borders, where they are sensitive and taught to be agents of change. They should be engaged and engrossed in the issues that affect mental health care systems, affecting their communities and neighboring countries. Wars in Gaza, Russia, Ukraine, DRC, etc. calls for student psychologists to be active and activism in psychology. It is thus going forward that early intervention is a plan to ensure access to mental health services will be part of my professorate through among various interventions. I will continue to participate in regulatory bodies and ensure transformative agenda embodied by the Constitution of South Africa, breathed by the principle of Botho. Keep the practice of educational psychology as in teaching and learning and research and community engagement. Apply for financial grants, especially for my South African pedia study and related neurodiverse disorders. Continue to plan and start a neurodiversity disorder center at the University of South Africa as part of contribution to child and adolescent mental health programs. Ke Tabane wa bodusa botholo mutla ke moshimanyana. Ke tlou shishunkwane sa khatla khunwane se re se mpona sa inama e re ke mohwe a bona mohwehadi. Ke motlogolo wa ditlogolo tsa mokaba malihlo le rotola ke lengwe. Tau e tswa seokodibeng sa mmameriti mebedi. Ke setlogolo sa mantšha o tlogele phatla e šale le beng. Ke morwa mologadi tšhelo le mano wa loga a tšea pheta a e romela leboa ke ra thuto. Ke pšhantla phiri seteatea le noka kwenane ke ramodungwane wa matladi papago makgeledisa. Thobela.
Vice-Chancellor of the University of South Africa, Professor Linkabula, Acting Vice Principal, Teaching, Learning, Community Engagement and Student Support, Dr. Chivase, Executive Dean of the College of Education, Professor Mpine Makwe, our key men for the day, Professor Ramudungwane Tabane, the Tabane family, the colleagues, the collaborators, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to respond to this inaugural lecture. I thank Professor Tabane for sharing work that addresses one of South Africa's most pressing challenges. Congratulations on this milestone. An inaugural lecture represents not merely academic achievement, but a public commitment to scholarship that will shape students, influence policy, and contribute to societal well-being. This lecture arrives at a crucial juncture. The intersection of mental health access, neurodiversity, and social justice is a pressing issue in South Africa. What makes it compelling is its refusal to treat neurodiversity as purely clinical. Professor Tabane correctly frames it as a matter of constitutional right, educational access, and social justice. When we discuss ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, or specific learning disorders, we are talking about children's future or children's futures and their rights to contribute meaningfully to society. What is it that I take as the key contributions of this inaugural lecture? In Prof. Tabane's work, I've identified 3 significant contributions. The first one, the evidence base for early identification. The longitudinal research cited demonstrates convincingly that untreated neurodevelopmental disorders create cascading adverse outcomes. Professor Tabane's own research strengthens this evidence in the South African context, particularly the 2012 study on the strengths and difficulties questionnaire and the 2023 situational analysis revealing that children are underrepresented in mental health facilities. The second contribution is the access crisis. The reality of a small pool of psychologists serving a population where the majority cannot afford healthcare speaks to a crisis of both capacity and social justice. The National Health Insurance represents potential for transformation. Although we still question ourselves, will implementation change, or will there be any changes that are made by implementation and remain significant? The third, and for me, it was a really important one, the Sapedia and objective assessment. This computer-based assessment approach is aimed to reduce subjective bias in diagnosis methodology that is methodologically sound. And I think it is a tool that can take us a long way in the South African context from where we are. However, Professor Tabane, I was sort of concerned by the fact that the study was said to be on hold or being revised. Therefore, I want to understand, or I'm trying to understand the challenges encountered. Would they be valuable for others pursuing similar work? Would it be something that different parties can join hands to ensure that this study continues? Because I think it is groundbreaking for our country. There are critical reflections. While I commend this work and its breadth and depth and its importance, I offer 3 key observations of this inaugural lecture. Professor Tabane, you have clearly shown the prevalence and the context question of our country. At this stage, you note in your lecture that the limited prevalence data in South Africa and the adoption of the Western norms remain a challenge. We ask ourselves whether do we have confidence in the statistics that we have? Purely we know that many people or many children are not even yet diagnosed or even identified for that matter. So we still are questioning the data that we have in terms of prevalence in our country. So the questions I'm asking myself are how might socio-economic factors, nutritional status, environmental toxins, and historical trauma affect neurodevelopmental presentation in our context? We face a tension. We need prevalence data for resource allocation, yet premature acceptance of the Western norms may obscure contextually specific patterns. So we need to be conscious that while we want to collect data, that data should be based on our own South African developed instruments. And your study and your lecture actually gives a standard for us to begin to work on that. We must also remain vigilant about the over-pathologizing childhood behaviors in the context of poverty. As we have said, if we look at this, if we take poverty, we take trauma, we take educational inadequacies. A child who cannot concentrate in an overcrowded classroom with inadequate nutrition may not necessarily have ADHD. They may have understandable response to an untenable situation. So it is important for us to ensure that we don't put every child in the bracket of ADHD as we see happening in our schools, which is a challenge. What is the intervention gap then? The lecture powerfully establishes the case for early identification and tries to provide insight into what happens afterwards. In a context of the number of psychologists, limited number of psychologists we have in the country, and the millions of people in need of such services, we need to ask ourselves, what are the scalable interventions that we can introduce? The traditional health practitioner study suggests possibilities for task shifting and utilizing community resources. Could teachers with appropriate training deliver evidence-based interventions? What roles might family interventions or school-wide approaches play? Those are some of the questions that Professor Tabane, as we continue in this work, I would want to engage with. Schools are positioned primarily as the sites where problems are identified, but they also may be sites of interventions and support outside the school system. This Reference to full service schools suggests this empowering possibility. However, we have too far and too spaced full service schools. Should it then been done also in the foundation phase, the pre-foundation phase? Shouldn't our early childhood centers be our focus if we really want to look at early identification? If we can identify neurodevelopmental disorders at 3, many children at 3 are already in preschools. They are already in early childhood centers. Maybe our focus should begin to look at those spaces. I also was impressed by the cultural validity. In our multilingual, multicultural society, how do we ensure assessment tools and diagnostic criteria are culturally valid? Do we risk misidentifying cultural differences as pathology or missing genuine difficulties because they manifest differently across cultural context? You can see, Professor Tabane, that I'm posing more questions than answers into your inaugural lecture because it has triggered in my mind and in my research questions that we who work in this space should actually begin to question and problematize. Looking forward, Professor Tabane has outlined ambitious plans. I suggest focusing on the implementation science, understanding how interventions can be implemented at scale in resource-constrained settings, particularly through partnerships with Department of Social Development, Department of Education, Department of Health, but also communities. Longitudinal studies, tracking children from early identification through adulthood so that we can see what works, for whom, and under what conditions does that work. Family perspectives. What are lived experiences of families raising children with neurodiverse children? What indigenous knowledges or knowledge systems and community resources exist? We already know that there are studies that talk about experiences of parents. And I think it is important for us to bring all those studies together so that we can hear the voices of those who live with this on a day-to-day basis and are the basic care workers or caretakers. Technology. Might smartphone penetration offer opportunities for app-based screening or support tools? I know currently there's a study at UNISA that looks that we are involved in some other funded project that looks at using apps. Maybe Professor Tabane, you could want to look at what are the app-based processes or app-based technologies that can be introduced for screening or support of these children. Indeed, neurodiversity is a social justice issue. This lecture ultimately concerns social justice. Every child who drops out due to undiagnosed ADHD, every adolescent in the criminal justice system who needs mental health support represents a failure of our collective responsibility. The neurodiversity framework, recognizing neurological variance as a natural diversity rather than deficit, offers a helpful lens. While early identification and interventions are crucial, we must also ask, how can schools, places of work, and communities become more accommodating of diverse learning styles and working people? Not every challenge requires medical intervention. Some require social adaptation. In closing, Professor Tabane, your lecture demonstrates a deep commitment to vulnerable children and to transforming a mental health system that too often fails them. Your research provides evidence where it is sorely needed. Your work in the regulatory body positions you to influence the next generations of practitioners. Your plans for Neurodiversity Center at UNISA promises to institutionalize and extend this work. And I can promise you, I will be willing to support you because you know that I opened the first Neurodiversity Center in higher education at the University of Johannesburg. And seeing centers spreading in institutions of higher education is at the core of my heart. You have chosen a challenging path. working at the intersection of mental health, education, social justice, and policy in a context of enormous need. But it is precisely because this work is difficult and it is also necessary. I encourage you to continue building partnerships with the different stakeholders, with communities, with traditional healers, with families who live these realities daily. Your work is strongest when it bridges the academic and the applied research and advocacy, the university and the community. I personally look forward to collaborating with you, as this is also my heartbeat, my niche area, and something that I live and dream about every day. Thank you for this thoughtful lecture, for your commitment to the South African children, and for the opportunity to engage with work that truly matters. Your commitment to the profession of psychology and your commitment to higher education is not unseen. Ke a leboga, ndiabuyela, bayadanki.
Prof. Tabane, again, I offer my heartiest congratulations to you on this academic success. Keep shining and flying UNISA's flag and your academic journey high. Welcome aboard the community of scholars, Prof. Congratulations to you for attaining this high level of your career. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, I bring this event to a close and wish Prof. Tabane all of the best for the future. Good evening to all of you.